Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Healthspan Action Coalition podcast. I am Dr. Sanjay Bojraj, interventional cardiologist and longevity expert. And with me is
Dr. Heather Main, but not a medical doctor, a PhD. So my background is biochemistry, molecular biology, and stem cells.
and the goal of this podcast is to bring you guys up to speed in all of the newest technologies and approaches for health span and life optimization and longevity. But one of the first questions that comes up, and one of the things that we'd like to establish is what is this concept of health span? We've heard it a lot and it's becoming more and more popular, but what does that mean? Heather, what do you think?
As I understand, it's about not just living longer, but actually being healthier. And then maybe even just being healthier regardless of living longer. So just about being healthier people. There was something I read about the UN WHO 10-year plan for healthier aging. And the goal there seems to be that, regardless of medical interventions, but lifestyle interventions as well, just to age better.
Yeah, and I think there's so many cool things that pop up with this, but as a physician, as an MD doc, one of the things that I often will see is that people are alive, but they're not necessarily living, right? And so what do I mean by that? Well, you can be biologically aware, but if you can't move, if you're bedridden, if you're on a ventilator, right? That's being alive without
Yeah.
necessarily being active. And what we want to do is really advance the science of allowing people to remain alive and live as long as possible. So we want to promote mobility, technologies that prevent aging at a cellular level, and really allowing us to get the most activity out of life so that on the day before you will ultimately pass away, and unfortunately, every single one of us will eventually no longer exist, right? But that day before you pass away, you're active, you're running around, you're doing what you want to do, you're enjoying your life, and not just in a bed or a chair or as a vegetable somewhere. So, Heather, from the PhD standpoint, I think we look at this, from very similar lenses, but with a different image, right? So on the PhD standpoint, I know that you've been involved a lot in longevity technologies and health span technologies. What are some of the things on the basic science side that you've seen people working on that seem really intriguing, and have a great likelihood of success in moving this needle of pushing health span?
My experience is in cell-based therapies and gene therapies, so using cells and genes as medicinal products. And so my interest in the health span action was when they're looking at healthy aging, we're looking at extending quality of life, right? And there's so many things that you can do with cells and genes. So if you look at pharmaceutical development in a general sense, you're starting with something synthetic like aspirin. We're moving on to proteins like insulin for diabetes. You've got some antibodies in there. There's been great success with antibody based pharmaceuticals for autoimmune diseases and for cancer. And we like to say the next generation is cell and gene therapies, where instead of trying to shut down a signaling pathway, getting lots of off-target effects like chemo, we specifically target the root cause of the disease. We target the genetics, or we replace the dead or defective cells. And so when I heard about the Healthspan Action Coalition, I guess what I was really interested in was this definition of aging as a disease, that there's so many diseases that have what we see now in this paper that you shared to me, the hallmarks of aging, that there's so many aspects in there where it's almost impossible to separate what is natural degradation versus what is aging. And it's all around cells and genes in my biased mind. And so this is kind of where I think our competencies are really going to combine well in the discussion of, what's out there and what does it really mean, I guess, on a cell and a gene based level. And that's where I am, the cells and the genes. I'm
Well,
not the patients.
and but all patients are made of cells and genes, right? And so
Yeah.
when you look at that, and in the show notes we'll reference this was a paper, I believe in the Cell, called the Hallmarks of Aging, and a really just fascinating study looking at the molecular and cellular causes of aging. So I think a lot of our listeners and a lot of people out there have heard about telomeres, these end caps at the end of our chromosomes, and they can degrade over time, and that promotes aging. But when we look at all the different factors, right? Cumulative DNA damage over time,
Mm,
proteins that are misfolding, the interaction between the microbiome, that environment, that ecosystem of good and bad bacteria in our gut, and how that affects our health. All of these things individually affect our longevity, right? But then as we look at them together, they provide this entire framework of potential therapies or different approaches to optimizing health, right? And as you mentioned so eloquently, Heather, is that, age happens, right? There's nothing we can do about that. But if there's ways that we can help cells recover, right, or to repair DNA damage through diet, through lifestyle, through and we can explore your history of dealing with on the cell and molecular side, some stem cells and things like that. If
yeah.
we can give the body back these useful factors, are we able to help improve health? I don't think any of us wants to live until we're 500 years old. But are we able to take away some of the aches and pains? Are we able to return the mobility? Are we, I think, able to improve cognitive function, which is something that I think a lot of people are concerned about nowadays in this era
Yeah.
as it comes to health span. So, what are some of the things on the because as a clinician, I have no idea stem cells, and we'll explore that in subsequent episodes of the podcast. But what are some of the things that you've seen already that you feel, wow, this could really move the needle on this health span concept?
Yeah. And so that's where I think it's like it's somewhat impossible to separate the this health span longevity from disease, because essentially what we're saying is as you're getting older you're more prone to disease, but a lot of the diseases that we're getting in aging, there's also genetic variants of them where you'll get them earlier. Like, for example, and always, always, always correct me if I say something about disease that is not correct. But for example, like Down syndrome, and you can get early onset Alzheimer's, there are genetic aspects there that you are getting Alzheimer's disease. Later on down the track, when you age, the genetics might not be so clear. And so it's a really interesting space of seeing aging as a disease, because there are people that have kind of more genetic early onset variants of these diseases. These are the people that my field is treating, cell and gene therapies. We're treating patients.
Yeah,
Longevity is kind of a difficult space. They're not patients. Technically, they're
right.
healthy. So it's kind of using that we're going to develop new therapies for these patients, for these progerias, for these different diseases, and that might also help us to live longer in a general sense. So if we want to go for exciting technologies or novel technologies in terms of in terms of cell and gene therapies, this is something that we're really going to dig into, because this is my field. In terms of gene therapies, you've got treatments like AAV, adeno-associated virus gene therapy. These are the gene therapies that are to some extent extra chromosomal. It's not into the DNA, but it's sitting in the cells. It's permanent as long as they're not proliferating too much. And we have so many great examples around the world now, already market approved examples of where AA gene therapy is helping for blindness and many genetic diseases. We have mRNAs. Everybody's heard of mRNAs. mRNA is something that's a bit more transient. It's going to go in, it's going to do its thing for as long as it's there, but it's going to degrade. It's not going into the cells and sitting in there as DNA that's going to be replicating, for the rest of the person's life. Um, we have genetic modification of cells. So if you look at something like a CAR T, which is pretty big news in terms of cancer treatments at the moment, where you're actually taking cells, genetically modifying them in the lab, and putting them back in the patient. And now the anticipation, at least with CAR T, is it's a relatively transient. It goes in there, it does the job, but you can have genetic modifications for other diseases like ADA SCID, the most sort of notable, the Bubble Boy, the
So
John Travolta movies.
severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome, SCID, right? For those
Exactly.
that
You
don't know.
basically have no immune system. And
Yeah.
that's what, the John Travolta Bubble Boy movie is getting at. And it's one gene. There's so many diseases. If you can see that it's one gene that's not working properly, if we can put that gene in, you could have a curative gene therapy. And we're having a lot of successes globally in genetic disease in this space. And so I think the foundations that we're establishing in that type of gene therapy towards established illness is going to be so useful in demonstrating safety.
Mhm.
That's then going to allow us to potentially treat healthy people for the sake of decelerating aging. And then if we skip away from gene therapy for a little way into cell therapy, so cell therapy and something we're going to get into later, right? Looking at the stem cells in the body, like what is the actual regenerative capacity of the body? If you ask a pluripotent stem cell snob like me, pluripotent stem cells are basically the cells that built our entire bodies. Back in the day, back in the Bush administration, everybody knew what embryonic stem cells were. And so, yeah, they're the cells that create every cell type of our body. And I've been working with those cells since 2003.
Wow.
In
So
20 years of growing.
I was not gonna do that math. I was not gonna do that math for you. But I think in your discussion, kind of a few interesting things really kind of pop out. Number one, as we approach health span, right? There's a few different populations of patients. So the diseases of that we see of early onset help us map out the genes that are associated with these specific conditions as they continue with age. So you mentioned early onset Alzheimer's, and I've seen people as young as 30 getting, Alzheimer's disease, so finding the genetic underpinning for that. That is oftentimes what moves the needle on science, but then generalizing those principles out then to the age related kind of the
Yeah,
cumulative damage effect, I think becomes really important. And then the other concept then is then using um, you know approaching diseases that we often die from, cardiovascular disease, cancer, infection, and making impact in our ability to deal with those will affect ultimately longevity and health span, right? So I think of in the cardiology universe, there's a lot of active gene work being done around this PCKS9 enzyme. There's a injectable cholesterol medication for that that basically helps you keep your LDL receptors. So you're using a lot of the receptors that pull out bad cholesterol from your body. But now there are technologies, small interfering RNA and things of that nature that you're probably more aware of that are basically like these cholesterol vaccines now that are in a longer term and then eventually moving into gene therapy where you can permanently kind of activate or inactivate these genes associated with cholesterol metabolism, and that's going to keep you alive longer.
no, but
So
in terms of those categories of people, right? Because it might be one thing to prevent aging, but in terms of lifespan as well, it may be that something's happened. Somebody's had a heart attack or what do you say, cardiac infarction. Um,
myocardial infarction, yeah.
yeah, so we have like quite a bit going on in the stem cell space as well, pluripotent stem cell derived cardiomyocytes for heart failure. And so, we may not be able to prevent illness, but we might be able to do something when it happens. And so if the heart is not able to generate, enough cells to regenerate itself, that then we could, with cell therapy, add them in. So it's many different ways of getting at different problems and different indications, right? And that's where I think it's going to be really interesting to explore cell and gene therapy in regard to aging and longevity.
Yeah, and there's like the biohacker bro kind of movement, right? Jump in ice water and take hot baths and go under this laser light. But, to your point, yeah, I mean, I think that the foundations of health span are actually keeping us healthy. It's in the name, entitled Healthspan, right? So keeping us healthy from these things. I came across a paper, wondering what your thoughts are. In on the clinical side, we're seeing a lot of what are now called, it's one of the scariest terms I've heard in a while, turbo cancers. So these cancers that are now presenting stage three, stage four, so they're presenting late stage and just really aggressive. And there's a paper recently in Nature, I think in Nature Reviews Cardiology or Oncology, saying that there's a thought that cellular aging, because of the burden of metabolic disease, that our cells are actually now much more older, or they're accelerating in age versus our chronologic age. And this may be one of the precipitating factors. You have loss of tolerance and loss of these repair mechanisms as to why these cancers are just spreading like wildfire in younger populations, particularly breast cancer. We're seeing a lot in the 30s, and colorectal cancers are happening kind of in the 20s and 30s as well. So as a gene therapy, gene stem cell kind of person, does that make sense? Like, could our cells be getting older faster? And is that a target for therapies?
God, you would hope not, right? In terms of getting older faster, like, and what I thought was interesting with this, the hallmarks of aging and looking at those different aspects of aging, there are still a lot of lifestyle factors in there, right? And there are still a lot of ways that we can potentially affect our aging, but there's certainly a lot of genetic in there as well. And I don't want to be too kind of explicit about it, but I definitely have my dad's genetics, and he did not age well. And so I'm not expecting miracles, honestly. And I don't think we can necessarily get around our own genetics. So, in terms of the formation of tumors, I couldn't be sure, but I do know of some really cool stuff going on in the gene therapy field at the moment. I'll give you two examples. There's a company in Sweden called Asgard Therapeutics, and we're going to get into this reprogramming, right? Looking at the Yamanaka factors and the effect on aging. So there's other cell types you can reprogram to, like Yamanaka factors will reprogram to something like those embryonic cells that I was talking about. But they've also found ways of kind of direct reprogramming of, the concept of looks like a banana, smells like a banana, tastes like a banana, like maybe it is a banana.
Hmm.
It's almost like tricking cells that they are a banana. And so this company in Sweden uses genes that trick the cancer cells into thinking they're a dendritic cell. And what's the job of a dendritic cell? It's like a flasher out in the park. You show everything.
It's
So,
it's involved in immune system recognition of bad particles and pathogens, right? Like, is that what you're
yeah.
saying?
And
Yeah.
so the cancer cell turns into a dendritic cell. It just shows the immune system everything. And the immune system's like, hang on,
That's
what are
not
all
supposed
these?
to happen here. Put a towel around that. Put something on.
Yeah, let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. And I think it's really cool to think about things like that. You're turning the cancer against itself by tricking it into thinking that it's a component of the body's immune system. And
Hmm.
then there's another group in Uppsala. I'm probably going to be very Sweden biased, not only because we're very good at science, but because I live there. And there's another company that
But you're
you
horrible
know,
at furniture that you have to assemble yourself.
well, it depends on who you're asking. They say
Yeah.
the test of a relationship is if you can assemble IKEA
Oh
furniture together.
boy, I had to build my daughter's bed over the weekend, and there were some non-fancy words used there. But anyway, so getting back to oncology.
Yeah, no. So this company, looking at the CAR Ts, like the concept of these CAR Ts for getting rid of mainly leukemias and lymphomas at the moment, is that the CAR T goes and binds to a B cell. It's not specifically binding to a mutated B cell. It's just binding to all the B cells and killing them. So you've programmed the immune system to say, get rid of all the B cells, because we know the problem is in some of the B cells. If we get rid of all of them, we get rid of the problem. And so it's a little more focused than chemo, because chemo would be, let's get rid of all the
The all
proliferating cells.
cells, yeah.
Now we're just getting rid of all the B cells, and it's temporary, it's transient. So hopefully it goes in, it kills them, and then the CAR T goes to sleep, and then new B cells come out. So you should be okay. But the problem there is, let's say if you're looking at a solid tumor, so instead of like a blood tumor, if you're looking at a solid tumor, there's all sorts of different cell types in there. It's a
Hmm.
real mishmash problem.
Yeah.
And so even if you say, oh, well, let's kill this particular, protein, let's bind this protein and kill those cells, all of the others won't be affected per se. So there's this really cool one in Sweden where it goes to that one protein, just like the other CAR Ts, and then as soon as it binds, it starts expressing a bacterial protein.
That your
And if
body knows is not supposed
that
to be
your
there.
body is like, what the hell is a bacteria doing there? And so then the immune system goes desperate to get rid of this bacterial infection and just starts killing cells, picking up all the like antigens of the solid tumor, and kind of programs the immune system to now be able to find the heterogeneity, like the diversity of cell types in that solid tumor.
So, I mean, this is fascinating. And as a clinician, what I love about what I get to do in my current work is learn about the basic science and how it may apply to clinical practice, right? But oftentimes we see a gap. In terms of time, a long time for these technologies to get from the bench and make their way to the bedside. And
Mm,
so, I think that is one of the really cool things about work like we do at Healthspan Action Coalition is is accelerating that process of getting from bench to bedside. And I know that that's a very kind of overutilized kind of pathway, bench to bedside, but it's really true. And what we aim to do with this podcast is really informing clinicians on the basic science and basic scientists on the clinical work, right? And kind of and
yeah,
building those things together. So, I think this was a really cool introduction to Healthspan and the work that we're going to do here at the Healthspan Action Coalition. I think that we're going to have amazing discussions about all sorts of different things, technologies I don't even like, parts of cells that I don't even know exist. It sounds like are things that you've forgotten. So I'm really excited about that. And I think, hopefully we'll bring a lot of listeners along for the ride. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Healthspan Action Coalition podcast. I hope you learned as much as I did. If you like what you heard, then please subscribe to the podcast. And if something provoked a thought, leave a comment. We love to hear your comments and we watch them regularly. Have a great day.